Hi, good evening, everyone. Omar, thank you for the beautiful introduction. You definitely, I think, nailed it. So no corrections necessary on the work of the breaks. And Leslie, it's so delightful to meet you, and thanks to both of you for the invitation. I'm going to screen share with you all. Okay. And I wanted to begin by saying that at this point in our rather extensive Zoom lives, we all know by now what happens to our bodies when we sit in front of screens and experience thought through screens. And so I wanted to invite those of you who are able to not follow along with my PowerPoint presentation, because nothing in the PowerPoint is essential to what I'm saying, but rather is just a visual to carry us along, and that I welcome you to have your body in whatever positions, or your eyes in whatever positions feel best to you. So what I'm offering today is a series of acts that circle around architecture, colonial surfaces, and trans-temporal anti-colonial kinships. I'm not, I should say from the outset, a trained architect or an architectural historian. Rather, I'm someone who, alongside thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Sarah Ahmed, considers how we've been and continue to be shaped by the places we dwell in, and how the stories we're told about those places and how and whether we fit within them concretize both in the flesh of our bodies and in our psychic lives. I want to think with you here tonight about other stories we've not yet been told, stories that are embedded in settler colonial architectures, that are part of our inheritance, even though we've not yet been made conscious or have not made conscious contact with them. While I pay attention to the force of colonial history as it is overlaid on architecture, my queries about specific sites and structures are invested in colonial architecture's differences, aimed toward the anti-colonial and minoritized histories that constitute the affective and material legacies of the places we live, dwell, and learn within. So let's begin with an architectural controversy, and start with a scene, one that is by now familiar to all of us here, in order to discard some governing false logics and to make room for what's to come. The scene takes place over this last year on a university campus in the American South, where community-led research on the institution's history led to widespread knowledge that the Student Commons building had been knowingly by the administration built on top of an unmarked slave burial ground, and that several building names on campus were in honor of enslavers who had contributed to the university's legacy. When a Black student coalition called for the building names to be changed, the university's Board of Trustees initially voted unanimously not to change the names. This announcement, unsurprisingly and rightfully, was met with community uproar and dissent. Of the demands by the campus community to change the building names, the most controversial site was Ryland Hall, a building where I've worked and taught for well over a decade. Structurally, it's an indisputably impressive space, designed in collegiate Gothic style by architect Ralph Adams Cram in 1913. The three-story building is adorned with Gothic tracery, decorative sculptural elements, a fourth-story tower, a gabled roof with slate shingles, and boasts huge cathedral-style leaded glass windows, as you can see here in this image, which flank the ends of its great hall, all giving it, as students are quick to point out, a Hogwarts-like appearance. Originally designed as the university library, it was named after Richmond College's first president, Reverend Robert Ryland, a university founder, a prominent Virginian, and the pastor of the first African Baptist church. Ryland holds a special place in the university's history. He made plain and public that he believed that all people deserved equal access to biblical teaching, and that he, quote, objected to slavery in the abstract, end quote. Yet he also enslaved over 24 Black men, women, and children over his lifetime, making his critique of slavery an enduring abstraction. In his own words from a sermon in 1852, when abolitionist discourse was in wide circulation, Ryland stated unequivocally that, quote, God has given this country to the white people. They are the lawmakers, the masters, the superiors. The people of color are the subjects, the servants, and even when not in bondage, the inferiors. Now, returning to the controversy, those who desired to preserve the building name believed that Ryland was, quote, a man of his time, whose values were in line with the dominant logics of his era. Their objections to denaming the building centered on two key beliefs. First, that to remove Ryland's name from the building would be to erase history, to forget that Ryland, as first president, had fundraised monies to build the building, and to dishonor the purported truth of the past and the legacy of the architectural space. I'm going to return to this point in just a moment. The second objection was that we must weigh the good and the bad and see a holistic life when considering or reconsidering honorary namings. Under these logics, Ryland's status as the university's founder and his work as a pastor for enslaved peoples would situate him, according to these logics, on the side of ultimate greater social good. Slavery within this logic becomes a singular bad thing, reduced to one action among many, one card in the game, rather than a series of incalculable actions and proliferating effects that continue to reverberate into our everyday lives from this place in the present. Notice here that none of the arguments about naming preservation have anything to do with architecture itself, with its structure or materialities, with the artfulness of the space, with the architecture of architecture, or with who might have actually crafted these structures with their laboring bodies. In my capacity as the faculty representative on a commission formed to create principles at the university for namings, denamings, and renamings on campus, I was invited this past autumn to listen to a closed presentation by a best-selling architectural historian whose work considers architectural controversies across the nation. His approach was a deeply liberal one, and though I may be oversimplifying it here, at its core, his stance was this: slavery was bad, yet our nation was founded on it. There are some founding figures, like former Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, whose actions were so clearly reprehensible that we must dename public spaces that honor him. And then there are others, like former President Thomas Jefferson, or for our purposes here, like Robert Ryland, whose contributions may ultimately be greater than his ills. These mainstream perspectives, captured both by the architectural historian and the Ryland defenders, are interesting to me because they reflect the colonial logics through which we've learned to approach and consider architecture, history, and legacy. What kind of logic do we follow when we believe that the true history of any place is best and most accurately located via histories of empowerment, privilege, and commerce? In the architectural historian's logic of parsing the differences between white colonial enslavers, we see emerge a liberal desire to preserve a history based in capitalist logics and European actors, that the truth of this nation is to be found in a phantasmatic origin of white dominance, as though the settler colonial architectures that we move through are not themselves embodied, do not hold a multiplicity of histories, are not themselves archives of affects and bodies that have circulated through them, but are simply colonial byproducts forced to live out a Eurocentric logic. In the 1980s, a group of highly educated South Asian historians founded the Subaltern Studies Collective, most of them educated in the West's most prestigious institutions. These historians diagnosed that history, the way the nation formally remembers its past, is premised upon the centrality and superiority of Europe. It uplifts the great men of Europe and its colonial histories, and it understands history itself as a product of domination and a very limited and often profoundly destructive notion of greatness. What the Subaltern Studies Collective sought to undertake is a displacement of European narratives from the center of history, and in so doing to uplift what they called histories from below, to make and tell history not from the perspective of European conquest, but from the smaller, more localized forms of resistance and insurrection to those conquests that are stamped out or discarded by official national narratives. There are many ways, of course, of telling and internalizing history, some that uphold Eurocentric logics and the official stories of the nation, and others that break from its strangleholds and erasures that let us frame and feel the world otherwise. One path toward this is through what I've called in my first book, Unthinking Mastery, dehumanism. Dehumanism looks to those who have been excluded from the category of man, that racist and misogynist construction at the heart of Enlightenment thought and action, turning our attention instead toward those who have been excluded from the category. Following thinkers like Alex Wahalia and Sylvia Wynter, dehumanism requires not an easy liberal repudiation or renunciation of dehumanization, but a form of radical dwelling with the dehumanized. It summons us to invest in what we might learn from those who have, across geographies and histories, been excluded from the masterful domain of man. What life-sustaining ways of living, of gathering, of surviving, of refusing might we learn from those communities who have been excised from this modern European version of humanity? What other possibilities for life and living can we learn in these other modes of being human? In my newest book, The Breaks, I spend significant time ruminating over architecture, a fact that may seem odd given that the book takes the form of a long letter to my daughter, as Omar has said, about race, inheritance, and mothering at the end of the world. The Breaks wonders over how the architectures of domestic space presume certain conventions of living, most often through the form of a heterosexual nuclear family. As an unconventional family, one made up of two queer platonic parents rather than a couple form, the model for living offered through architectural design has required significant rearrangement and play as we've sought to find ways to inhabit space and to have space hold the queer shape of our lives. I'm going to read just a few short paragraphs from the Breaks here to offer you a flavor of how architectural questions arrive and shape intimate scenes of family life. All you need to know is that the text is addressed to my daughter, that our family now lives in a duplex with Nathan, my best friend and co-parent, living downstairs and I above. And that among other things, the Breaks is as much trying to teach as it is to learn other modes of living. Over the last decade of our lives in the American South, the architectures that have housed us are imprinted with histories of slavery and racialized servitude. How we move and feel through these houses, how we make them into homes, is informed and haunted by these brutal pasts. In the face and feeling of all this, we make home through questions, asking ourselves and each other who fits here and why. Why do some bodies move through and around this space comfortably, while others are made to feel alien? What are the boundaries of the duplex, and where are its seams? How can this space become more than its bricks and boards, more than its racist history, more than a shield that conceals our private lives, more than a thing we have bought on loan, more than the privilege of financial investment, more than your economic inheritance? These questions keep us in our heads, in the realm of theory, where the adults in our family feel most at home. You, on the other hand, have already begun to push theory to its limits, pressuring us to consider how our beliefs might become a living politics. We are on the street, gazing at a sprawling red brick house. I am admiring the exterior architecture aloud, inviting you to wonder with me over the shapes within. There's a carriage house at the edge of the backyard, a loft space I envision as a writing den. I've always found this notion romantic, an artistic bourgeois fantasy of stumbling out your door through the flowers into a studio space where your work could unfold in quiet solitude. You'd need an enormous family to fill this house. What would we do with all that space? I ask rhetorically. Without missing a beat, you offer a quickly calculated response. I have a perfect plan, you say. We could move into a corner of the house on the second floor and open up the spaces in the house for homeless kids and their families. We could make separate rooms for each of the families and a shared playroom for the kids that I could fill with my old toys. I could babysit the kids so that parents have time for themselves, and we could make huge pots of soup every day that would always be cooking on the stove for anyone who feels hungry. Can we do this? Can we please? I adore this vision in which our lives become oriented around service to others rather than the queer crafting of space for our familial selves. I feel myself differently through your articulation, exposed by my limits, but also filled with desire for your dream of a life I am not yet living. I love this idea so much, I say, curbing a swell of emotion. You know, Amma, if we all share the space upstairs in the duplex, we could open Nathan's apartment downstairs to people who needed it. We don't need a mansion to do this. Although I know this conversation is spontaneous, it's delivered as though you've been plotting it for months now, preparing your pitch. You offer a clear layout for where the families would live and sleep in the duplex, which existing doors could be shut for their privacy, which rooms could be maintained for collective gathering and play. As far as I can see, there's no flaw in your plan. Nothing stands in our way, aside from a point of contact where my conceptual willingness collides with my hesitation to transform the conditions of our lives for a larger whole. A tug of war in which my self-contained privilege pulls hard against the promises of your desired politics. In this book, architecture emerges as a vital site through which to reimagine what family is as shape and limit, as a structure through which we might reconsider what we mean by inheritance, history, and belonging. A way of thinking about how property is both and always a signal of brutal legacies of dispossession, and also a space in which more expansive forms of kinship might unfold. How can we approach architecture dehumanistly, looking not to the grand historical narratives of the colonial past, but toward the other lives whose contact with place is vital to its legacies? This question moves us into my new feature-length experimental documentary film project, a collaboration currently in development with filmmaker Chase Joint, whose work has just won all the awards at the Sundance Film Festival and whose film Framing Agnes, about a really incredible trans history. You should all watch if you have the opportunity to. So our feature-length documentary film project that disrupts and disorients colonial history by offering up the alternative legacies of a single brick and mortar home in central Canada. The documentary looks to architecture as a spatial, temporal, material, and affective portal through which to tell unexpected histories of Indigenous uprising, minority rights, eco-political activism, and the racialization of a nation. Weaving the structural, political, and intimate histories of the house, the film illuminates forgotten feminist pasts and tells the transgenerational stories of its inhabitants. Our aim is to retell 140 years of Canadian history through a single space, exploring how built environments contain subjugated stories of the past and how we are affected, even when we remain unaware, by the historical traces and ghosts that linger in our dwelling places. We live in architectures, but we also become them as they become us. We slough and shed ourselves there, leaving ourselves behind, as we also breathe in architecture. Those of us who have been there in place make up its history in the same way that we are made by and through its histories. When we leave, we remain. When we leave, we carry architecture with us. I grew up in a sprawling beige brick mansion in ruin, my parents having purchased the house in 1980 for the cost of the river-adjacent acre of land it sat on. A 2.5-story beige brick Queen Anne-style mansion built in 1882, the house is nestled in a small, opulent neighborhood known as Armstrong's Point, a community of homes shaped by a natural bend in the Assiniboine River. Once a meeting ground for Indigenous peoples, the house is tucked away in central Winnipeg, the cold, beautiful heart of Canada. At the time our family moved in, its original Victorian features had all been stripped away. A wraparound veranda that had once given it a most regal look, a sleeping veranda that jutted off the front of the house from the master bedroom, a dormer reaching into the trees from the third-floor roof, and a widow's walk on top of the house had all been torn away in the post-war years to make the house look a la mode, more suburban and box-like, and to avoid the cost of upkeep and repair. I grew up knowing the home as the J.B. Monk House, as it is named in the National Archives after a wealthy banker from out east who moved into the house in 1895 to manage the Bank of Ottawa. Monk's family lived there for more than 60 years, and it was this history that framed my knowledge of the house's past, an explicitly colonial history, a history of commerce and national development, of westward expansion and white affluence. Truth be told, it's a history that rhymed with my own experience of the place. As a mixed-race family in a purportedly multicultural Canada, we were told in more and less subtle ways that our kind was not welcome in this beautiful Riverbend neighborhood. My now disabled mother has lived in the nest for over 40 years and has spent the greater part of her life tending to and restoring the house. It was through conversation with her in the early pandemic months that I discovered the house's original name, the Nest, given to it by a prominent Indigenous Métis family, the Bannatynes, an early Winnipeg family who originally built and lived in the house. This revelation is one that set the whole project in motion because from the vantage point of my own youth and from the vantage point of colonial history that informed my entire education and sense of place, I could never have imagined that an Indigenous family had built this structure, had lived in this grand Victorian abode, had always been my brick and mortar kin. The discovery of this alternative origin has opened me to a host of other unknown or unacknowledged histories of this single place. Histories that have included anti-colonial struggles, ecological activism, the fight for disability rights, in particular for deaf education, and still emerging immigrant histories. The Nest, as the house's original name, signals to me a kind of relation to all those who came before and who will come after, a name that constructs the architectural kinships I never knew I had. The Bannatynes named the house the Nest because they were also building a castle next door to the south, making the Nest seem quaint in comparison. At the time, circa 1882, the area was a heavily wooded riparian forest. These two Bannatyne homes were the first to be built on this land, homes that felt more countryside than urban. If the concept of nesting first struck Chase and I because of the house's original name, it has also quickly emerged as a metaphor for the technique of woven, scavenger-based storytelling that we are engaging to craft the project. animating the house by and through different material and narrative threads that constitute our film. I should note here that our project is not about telling other people's stories or histories. The nest turns attention to the racialized and minoritized pasts of those who lived, organized, studied, and worked in the house. But its aim is not to tell the stories of the variously marked people who've lived there. Rather, it's a way of understanding from a particular narrative perspective how each of these histories that are not mine in any conventional sense becomes instrumental to understanding history and our locations within it, precisely from those vantage points we've been taught not to consider. In our project, these multiple histories become queer forms of inheritance, ones we don't necessarily know we have until we unravel what we thought we knew and begin to intimately weave in the bits and pieces of other pasts that still linger. Building on Chase's prior documentary work, our film deploys trans as method, which is to say we engage stories at and beyond the limits of their predetermined or assumed containers. While Chase has historically tethered his approach to telling transgender stories, we see the practice as one that can be productively mobilized toward other minoritized politics and narratives. Here, trans as method, or pushing beyond the limits of the stories we've been told about ourselves and each other, becomes a strategy for linking otherwise siloed minoritized histories. This method allows for a vital reorientation to connectivity, which motivates us to reach across forms of difference toward more nuanced, expansive, and aesthetically compelling futures. To do this work, we pay critical attention to the ways that architecture and space have set the frame, texture, and terms for understanding personal and collective histories. Let's consider how this method works for the purposes of this architectural reckoning by dwelling for a few minutes on fire's intimate history with the house. In 1894, 12 years after it was first built, the nest caught fire. It burned and burned, nestled in an isolated riparian forest, while the Assiniboine River pulsed abundant water behind it, and a quarter-mile away, fire trucks spun their cartwheels in the muddy road. While the fire was serious, the extent of the damage remains unknown, except to note the post-fire rebuilding effort was significant. What's interesting to me here is that in the historical record, the house's history begins again in 1885, after the house is rebuilt, all but forgetting the 14 years that came before the fire. This, in fact, is how it becomes enduringly known as the J.B. Monk House, who bought it after the fire and its reconstruction. In other words, the fire resets the stage of the house's history and begins it again as though it is simply and solely a colonial space. Over the years of her restoration of the house, my mother has discovered the old char marks on the original bricks hidden behind the walls, like 100-and-something-year-old scars bearing the marks of this otherwise long forgotten trauma. Whatever parts of the new house are said to have been built on the site, they're said to have been built in the exact likeness of the first structure, making it a strange kind of replica, one that incorporates into its own body the body of the thing it replicates. Initially, I desired to parse the difference between the two structures, to locate the seams between the original structure and its double. But each had grown into the other, becoming more than a single thing, something weirder and mightier. It wasn't long before I began to relish this brick and mortar metabolism, how we can no longer know where the ruined place meets and becomes the one that came after, just as we can no longer separate our own histories from the ones that came before us. If the history of the house begins again after the fire, what is lost? Not only the house's incredible Indigenous history, which ties it to anti-colonial resistance and community organizing efforts as the nation of Canada absorbed Indigenous territories, but also another incredible history of disability rights and access. In 1891, the first residential school for the deaf and dumb, as it was formerly called, now the Manitoba School for the Deaf, caught fire. No one was injured, but the faculty and students were abruptly displaced and found refuge in an empty mansion, none other than the Nest, where they lived and learned within its walls across the years 1891, or the school year 1891 to 1892, while their school building was repaired. This is the year that the deaf students were granted their first printing press, an object that today sits dusty in a closet in their current school, but was inaugurated in my childhood home. The deaf students were learning how to use the printing press by way of vocational training, offering them practical skills for future employment. It was during that year, when they lived at the Nest, that they launched their first issue of The Silent Echo, a newspaper about deaf life that would become instrumental to securing the rights and freedoms of deaf Canadians. When the Nest would catch fire 2 years later, these crucial histories of Indigenous struggle and disability rights would be all but lost to an historical record that too easily begins again, makes cleaves where there ought not to be, leaves narratively behind so much of what remains still palpably present. We Singhs nearly set fire to the Nest ourselves circa 1892, when my mother took to furiously tearing down all the gaudy wallpaper that adorned the house's walls. Remembering the state of the house when we took occupancy, my mother likes to declare that, quote, the surface of the house was at war with itself. When she had amassed huge piles of variously colored velvet flock paper, we children gathered by the fireplace to burn the pieces. The flames transfixed us. Unlike other fires we had known, these were the magical flames of ecologically catastrophic materials. This was a lesson in flames, of learning that the materials brought into the house to dress it in post-war fashion were made of fossil fuel-based materials, marking an era of the house's history in which it would begin to reflect an increasingly ecologically catastrophic world. Fire across these three vignettes brings us to variously knitted threads of our stories, from anti-colonial history to minority rights and deaf education, to the mid-century turn to carbon-based materials and the ecological activisms that would take shape in and around the house over the decades of my activist mother's reign there in the 1980s and 1990s. Fire is a thread that weaves the counter-history of the Nest, knitting together narrative bits and pieces that otherwise appear unconnected, inconsequential to each other. Okay, let me now close by way of introducing you briefly to a misfit cast of female characters who are all tied historically through contact with the Nest. This is Christine Common Singh, born in 1938. Christine is an 84-year-old former nurse, environmental activist, and historical buildings preservationist in Winnipeg. She's the Nest's current occupant and also my mom. Having moved into the house in 1980, when all of its original elements had been torn away or covered over, Christine has spent the better part of her life restoring the Nest to its original state. She's responsible for its heritage designation and its decades-long restoration. And as the house's amateur archivist and historian, she has lived in the Nest for 42 years, where she raised 4 mixed-race children with her Indian husband before divorcing him and converting the home into one of Manitoba's premier bed and breakfasts. She ran the inn until age 80, when she suffered a catastrophic fall and became seriously disabled. Christine is a first-generation immigrant who was born in Ireland to a German Jewish mother who lost home and family in the Holocaust. She immigrated to Montreal as a teen, married an Indian medical student, and hesitantly followed him to Winnipeg in pursuit of his career. When she stumbled upon the Nest and purchased it without consent of her husband, she discovered there a sense of home in a life otherwise characterized by political and personal displacements, a deep and enduring sense of kinship with both the land and the brick and mortar structure. She's connected to this place so completely over the last 4 decades that it's become nearly impossible to separate her flesh and bones from the brick and mortar structure, or her blood from the pulsing river behind the house. Her arms seem like the limbs of the pre-colonial oak and elm trees that tower over the land. Her skin, the surfaces of the house. Her organs, the mansion's ancient plumbing technologies. Christine is now preparing to sell the house, evacuating it of its contents, and is in this capacity the anchor of our story. This is Annie Bannatyne, née Annie McDermott, born in 1832 and passed away in 1908. Annie Bannatyne is someone who I knew nothing about and had never heard of as a child growing up, but her activism and revolutionary actions in the Red River settlement, which was the name of the place before Winnipeg, before it became Winnipeg through absorption by the Canadian government. Annie has become an urban legend to those devoted to Indigenous history in Manitoba. A Métis woman, Annie was an active fundraiser whose work led to the establishment of the Winnipeg General Hospital, coincidentally the hospital where my mother was admitted for months after her fall in the house and her stroke. She is best remembered for an extraordinary action she took in 1869, when a white colonial man from Toronto named Charles Mair reaped the benefits of Métis hospitality in the Red River settlement, and then published disparaging comments about Métis people and their women in particular. Annie took it upon herself when he returned to the Red River settlement to drag him out of her storefront by the ear and to horsewhip him in public. It's this act of resistance that's now cited by historians as the inspiration for Louis Riel's anti-colonial resistance movement against the Canadian government trying to possess Métis land. Since we're in the US, and I'm probably talking to many people who don't know Canadian history here, Louis Riel is probably the most contentious and exciting figures of early Canadian history, seen in turns as a great anti-colonial revolutionary hero by some, and as a traitor to the nation by others. And I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. So Annie, in any case, is it's her action of horsewhipping that leads Louis Riel to publish his first opinion pieces in the press in support of Métis women and in support of his Métis community. Annie is the grand matriarch of the nest. Her son built the house next door to his mother and father's house, their castle. Annie was the grandmother of the first children to live at the nest, and the two houses share an interesting, intimate, and often indistinguishable history in the Winnipeg archives, but only one of the houses survived. The castle was demolished in 1850. However, Annie's 6-foot-long clawfoot tub from the castle in 1950, when her home was demolished, was carried over to the nest and now exists on the 3rd floor of that house, where it continues to hold forth. This is Mary Eddy McDermott, Manitoba's first deaf teacher, 1890 to 1906. Mary moved into the nest for that academic year when she and her students who were living at the residential school for deaf students caught fire. They came to live in the house over the course of that academic year, and she would have taught and lived in the house in 1891 to 92. And she was an art teacher, but most certainly would have been part and parcel of the first printing press being installed in the house, and having the first issues of the Silent Echo that I mentioned earlier start to circulate through the community and across Canada, in an effort to secure rights for deaf Canadians. This is Edna Norenberg, who was a maid from a very rural part of Manitoba. She had an 8th grade education, And she had a teacher who really liked her, and she didn't want to live out a farm life, the life of a farm wife, and really wanted to go to the city to try to carve out another path for herself. And she had a teacher who helped her to find a position as a maid during the J.B. Monk era of the house. So she moved in during the rise of Hitler at the beginning of the Second World War. She moved into the house, and she came from possibly Jewish ancestry, but a German background, and spoke some German. And so in her capacity as a maid in the house, she was asked to stand beside the radio and to translate Hitler's speeches from German into English for her wealthy employers. And I know this, I should explain that I know this because when my mother became a kind of fierce eco-political feminist activist in Winnipeg during my childhood, a Winnipeg reporter reached out to my mom named David O'Brien and said, hey, we're covering you a lot in the newspaper right now, and I wanted you to know that you live in a house where my mom used to work. And so David's now retired, an older gentleman, but has been in contact with me about his mom's early experiences working as a maid in the house. This is the only part of the house's history that I did know, was the history that just predated my family moving in, and it's kind of extraordinary. So it's the era of the house when for 15 years, from the early 1970s to the late 1980s, it became the Japanese consulate of Manitoba. And the consulates were established after the internment of Japanese people during the Second World War as a kind of make good effort to reinstantiate Japanese Canadians into the community and to undo some of the enemy status that had been created through the violent internment and exclusion of Japanese Canadian people. And so for 15 years, it was rented as the Japanese consulate before we moved in. This is the sole part of what I knew, but it so happens that they had elaborate tea ceremonies, Japanese song and dance celebrations, the emperor's birthday celebrations regularly at the house, and that there's an archive in the Winnipeg newspapers of events that took place at the house. And through that archive of covering tea ceremonies and such, I discovered a girl named Masa Okazaki, and you will see that this intentionally blurred 1966 yearbook photo is is from me Googling her name and finding the only appearance that I've been able to find of her is this blurry image of her when she would have been in 10th grade at Churchill High School in Winnipeg. I know from the librarian at the school that she was also got really into curling, the great Canadian sport of curling. But we haven't been able to find her, and nobody from the Japanese Canadian community in Winnipeg knows what happened to her. But she was the consular's daughter and would have lived in the house for many years in the 60s to early 70s before we moved in. And one of the things that I find really compelling is the fact that a Japanese girl lived there before me. And when we moved in, we were made to feel like absolute racialized aliens that didn't belong in this very white neighborhood. And yet there was a predecessor right before me that I very much wish I had known about as a child. And last but not least, Lillian Gibbons. I'm aware of time, so I'm gonna slow myself here, but Lillian Gibbons, born in 1906 to 1996, was the reporter who covered the Japanese era of the house, but also has an extraordinary collection of articles that she wrote over 60 years working as a reporter. She was an independently wealthy, very obviously in my mind queer woman who wore very bright colors, wouldn't make eye contact with anybody, was a kind of ecological activist, totally obsessed with houses, and has a collection, had a column for 40 years called Stories Houses Tell. And she's an inspiration both because she moved in and out of the nest by way of reporting, but also because she ended up, and again, I didn't know any of this until this period of research, she worked with my mom in heritage preservation matters in the 80s and 90s, and is a kind of bird-like, following the metaphor of the nest, figure who kind of flits in and out of the scene by way of reporting. So this strange cast of historical figures brought together through the nest and through the act of dehumanist nesting asks us how we might find and cultivate forms of decolonial belonging in ways we've not yet been taught to consider. Through strange connections based on land and in place that acknowledge colonialist histories by detaching from them, weaving us into communities far afield from the ones we've been told we belong to, allowing us to understand that we are intimately and indeed ethically linked through space and across time to communities whose lives and struggles may have been quite unlike ours, but to whom we are deeply, even molecularly, indebted, and to whom we might reach for new ways of shaping and inhabiting our political and social lives. Dehumanist nesting is not only an act of revisioning or re-envisioning the lives we might lead in the structures that contain us, but becomes a practice through which we can begin to imagine other ways of framing our legacies, of putting them together into shapes and configurations that unsettle our colonial homes, and in so doing, make way for more ethical forms of unsettled decolonial attachments.